There's another video on the topic of atheism, agnosticism, and so forth that really needs to be made. And it's something I don't think that's been pointed out quite thoroughly enough by people who have actually studied the internet, by those of us who are non-believers ourselves. Of course, I am an atheist as well as a Satanist, Satanism being more philosophical than religious. And it's a point that people haven't explored fully. And that's the role of the internet in spreading atheism, agnosticism, and liberal forms of deism as well, when you look at the number of social Christians, Muslims, and Jews living particularly in the United States and also in parts of Europe, Australia, basically anywhere which has widespread internet access, and that could be certain Muslim countries as well in this modern age when some of them are developing more rapidly. You see more internet hookups, in many cases censored, unfortunately, but in some cases not so much. And this is the basic point, that the rise of atheism, agnosticism, the rise of non-belief in general, the idea of disbelief in a personal creator, disbelief in organized religion, and so forth, coincides with the development of a more cohesive internet experience. Of course, we can remember it wasn't until the mid to late 90s that most of the people in the Western world had access to a stable internet connection. Until then, it was widely limited to people with upper incomes, individuals who were in universities or colleges. Of course, they would have had access through computer labs that they had set up in those locations. The internet isn't very old, and it wasn't very long ago, and indeed I can remember a time when the internet sites that you could visit were primarily text-only readouts. There was no style sheet for any of these sites. Chatting was always text-only. You didn't have, any of these little characters that you have in chat rooms now. You certainly didn't have video conferencing unless you were super rich and could afford an amazing connection, and even then it was tenuous at best. You go back several decades and you really have no real coherent internet technology to use to spread information other than text. Of course, in this age, we have essentially homegrown propaganda. Every other meme picture on the internet dealing with religion or politics or culture in some way. You have video clips all over the internet. Of course, the advent of YouTube, I would argue, is probably one of the most potent spreading ways of atheism that the earth has ever seen. The reason for this is as follows. Until a cohesive and widespread internet usage appeared, there were always the same number of atheists and agnostics. The sort of social Christians and Muslims and Jews that I mentioned that essentially only practiced their religion insofar as they believed it was expected of them, and there was no community outside of that religious belief, that they would somehow be stigmatized or cast out of their community for not believing in that specific God and adhering to those specific dogmas. What the internet did was give the ability for those, because when it first started there was absolute free speech on the internet. You couldn't really be stopped from saying what you wanted to say. Of course, now a little bit less so, but it's still relatively free, thankfully, at least for the time being. Killing off of SOPA and PIPA and so forth helped. It drew together the atheist communities. The people who were openly atheist, and there weren't many of them, quickly seized upon the internet as a way to not push their agenda, but put their ideas out there. Of course, Christians, the fundamentalists, will say atheists run the internet and they use it to push their propaganda. Not really. What they started doing was putting their ideas onto the internet. Other individuals who already had those ideas, but were social Christians or whatever, seized upon those and realized they were not alone. It did the same thing for the homosexual community. Of course, in the 90s, we started seeing the homosexual community become more open about their beliefs, about their existence. We saw the same thing with Wiccans. We saw the same thing with pagans. I credit the internet, above all other things, as being the progenitor of the rise in all minority faiths around the world. We may even see a resurgence of some of the old Zoroastrians or Mithraists or any of these groups simply by virtue of them having an internet presence, because people will research things. People will say, I agree with X, Y, and Z within this denomination, within this religion, within this political group. Those that are able to capitalize on the internet more effectively will, in essence, run the world very quickly. We see that levels of disbelief in God, or at least reported disbelief in God, and you can look at this both ways. The people who were asked about their belief in God before the advent of the internet and before they understood there were indeed millions and millions of people who agreed with them about not believing in God, probably underreported that fact quite substantially. I think the levels haven't changed. I think the openness about being atheist or agnostic has changed. That is, that while there are indeed people streaming into atheist camps and agnostic camps simply because people are more educated now about evolution, about science, and so forth, and they can see the lies of religion, it's quite plain. If they study any religious history, if they study any science, they're more likely to become atheists or agnostics because they can see the lies of religion. But even people who predominantly agree with a Christian philosophy or a Jewish philosophy or whatever would see that they're not alone, and they would come into those camps openly. They were already agnostic. They were already atheist. The conversion rate to non-belief isn't so much a reflection of propaganda stemming from atheists and agnostics. It's primarily a result of people who were already parts of those groups but simply weren't willing to admit it because they were afraid of being outcasts, of nobody liking them. Look at it this way. You're raised in a farming community of 1,000 people, which is 99.9% Christians. You're the only person there who is an open atheist. Before the advent of a more cohesive internet, you were truly alone. Unless you were living in an urban area where there was a higher likelihood of other like-minded people potentially coming into your group, you were essentially completely alone and cut off from the world. Unless you could receive some, tin horn radio broadcast from some dude up in a shack on the mountain talking about space aliens, you probably didn't have many friends. However, now that most people in the country have internet access, we can see a rise in atheism and agnosticism simply as a result of people being more open about the subject. I would also argue the fact that fundamentalist Christianity and fundamentalist Islam and these various fundamentalist groups around the world being predominantly located in rural areas, fairly far away from decent access, has prevented them from capitalizing on the internet quite so well. Look at it this way. I get most of the views that I get on YouTube from urbanized states and countries. I don't get a lot of views from Mongolia. I have, but very, very few. That's because the internet connectivity doesn't exist there. So in more rural areas where we're seeing a much slower increase in atheism and agnosticism, as opposed to more urbanized areas where it's growing drastically, for instance, Vermont that has gone from, and Vermont, just so you know, it is rural, there are a lot of farms, but it still has a relatively high population density. So we've seen Vermont go from about 10% non-belief to about 35% non-belief in just over a decade. It's a very, very quick increase because most of Vermont has good internet access. Most of Vermont is keyed into the world. You're not going to see that necessarily in Wyoming or Alaska or Mongolia or Siberia. You're going to see that predominantly in urban areas. So areas which are more connected to the internet, astonishingly, are becoming hotbeds of disbelief. I would say that while it's not the only reason for this, the internet plays a key role in this phenomenon. Atheism and agnosticism haven't so much gained popularity as people have been more willing and open about their beliefs on the subject to call themselves atheists and agnostics. Look at me. I was a Christian for a time. When I was in my late teens, I was a fundamentalist Christian. Until I converted to fundamentalist Christianity, I was a social Christian. I kind of believed in the Christian God because I was brought up in it. I kind of believed in the Bible. I didn't think it made a huge amount of sense. Of course, fundamentalism was sort of a phase I went through, sort of the anti-rebellious phase, ironically, because I was also a conservative in a state which is predominantly liberal, so you can chalk it up to that. Although I did believe in, Jesus is my savior, and I'm going to go to church and tithe and all that stuff. But for most of my existence, I was a social Christian. I was an agnostic. I didn't really honestly and truly believe in that God, or that text, or that church community. I was Christian merely because my parents were Christian. Well, my dad's more of an agnostic as well, but him for the same reasons, brought up Christian, brought up believing the Christian God, going to the Christian church. It's just a matter of being brought up in that sort of institution, in that sort of phenomenon of everyone around me is Christian, I've got to behave like them or I'll be an outcast. That's the way it works. When the internet opened up, and I didn't have a home internet connection until I was in my 20s. Until relatively recently, I had to either pirate Wi-Fi or go to the library to get the internet signal. Simply because we didn't have the money for it. Of course, it was available. It just wasn't enough money for it. When I went to college, suddenly I had access to the internet 24/7. I was enthralled by it. And I was always interested in history, so I studied the history of every religion I could think of, and some that I didn't even know existed. That's when I became a true atheist. I got into Satanism later more as a philosophical belief, but I'm still an atheist. I got into atheism because I looked at the history of these religious groups. I looked at the dogma behind these religious groups. I looked at the fact that what I had never considered, which was that there was a worldwide network of atheists, actually existed. I found people, atheists and agnostics, of like mind, who I did not know existed. I didn't know a single atheist until I was in college. I didn't even know atheism existed. That was how sheltered the existence was. Now, people these days, I think it's going to pick up even more quickly as far as non-belief growing. Because now the internet is something that's present. Everyone who was born in the mid-90s or later basically has had internet access stably available to them since they were born, or old enough to use a computer. People who, were in their teens around the mid-2000s, that was about when the internet became truly cohesive. Hello, I'm just making a video about atheism. Can I finish the video? I'm making a video about the terrors of atheism.
Oh, those scary...
Those terrible atheists that eat babies.
No morals.
I know. But anyway, you gotta realize, I'm 24. When I was fairly young, the internet was relatively underdeveloped. Hitting my teens, of course, in the late 90s and very early 2000s, that was about when the internet started becoming truly coherent and publicly available to individuals in their homes. Until then, I can remember when I was in 5th grade, I can remember when they installed the public PCs in the public library in my hometown, which, by the way, had about 1,500 people in the whole hometown. It was wild. All of a sudden, I had access to all of these wonderful things. Of course, at that age, I was more interested in looking up naked chicks and the definition of diarrhea. I wasn't really interested in the history of religion at that point. I was a 5th grader. I was 12 years old. Now, of course, people like my girlfriend back here take it for granted that by the time they were old enough to use a computer, it was primarily publicly available to anyone that had any means, and of course atheism, well, it is.
When I was a kid, my library didn't have computers. The public library didn't have computers.
That's because that's a redneck part of the country and they think that they're evil.
Florida's not redneck.
Just leave a comment. Tell me whether you think Florida's full of rednecks. I guarantee you do. Yeah, let me get my monster too. Predominantly, though, atheism and agnosticism, they're not growing just because of the internet. But they're validated in existence because of the internet. It allows a worldwide network of non-belief to exist And of course, people who back in the 50s would have been considered totally fringe communists by not believing in the Judeo-Christian God suddenly have a network available to them. It's not that it increased the number of atheists, it's that they allowed them to be more open about their atheism. Because, like I said, until the mid to late 1990s, there was really no internet structure, so to speak. Most of the chat rooms didn't exist. Most of the websites didn't exist. It was a lot smaller back then. I can remember back when the internet, you could have, if the internet had frozen at that point in time, it would have been physically feasible to see every website on Earth during your lifetime. Now it would be absolutely impossible. You'd have to flash by at the rate of one every 10th of a second or something just to see them all in your lifetime. It's a proliferation of ideas that builds up an international network of non-belief, and it's very important. That's why the most important thing to every non-believer on the face of the earth should be to absolutely oppose all forms of regulation and censorship on the internet, to keep it as free as is feasibly possible. Every influencing factor, government, business, organized religion, labor, lobbying groups, advertisers, anything which impositions itself into the internet and makes it harder to use or more regulated, needs to be strictly opposed by every atheist and agnostic and deist. And I know that there are people out there, there are probably people that will watch this video and they'll say, well, of course I'm a Christian. You may not be. You may just be a closeted atheist or agnostic. It's very, very possible that some of the people that have debated with me, claiming to be Christians or Muslims or whatever, are secretly on my side. They only argue those things because they believe that they're part of that specific network and community, either online or in real life. And they don't want the imposition on their lives of being stigmatized by those that they know and or love, saying, well, you're going to hell forever. We can see past the lies of religion partially by accessing information on their history and their culture, and partially by building up a network of non-belief around the world, which is very much alive and growing in strength by the tens of thousands every day. I mean, go on Reddit Atheist. I don't really use Reddit because I'm not, that kind of person. I don't wear, suit sweaters and, a tie all the time. But go on there sometime and watch as the live counter counts the number of people registered on their r/atheism forum. It grows pretty friggin' quick. It must be growing by the thousands every day. Peace out.